Most people who briefly die and come back describe light, warmth, an overwhelming sense of peace. But roughly 1 in 5 report the opposite. Darkness, descent, a hostile presence they couldn't see but could feel. What they went through didn't just frighten them, it changed them permanently. And the most unsettling part isn't what any one person describes. It's how much their stories overlap. Roughly 20% of people who report coming close to death describe an experience marked not by light, but by darkness, confusion, and fear. Yet even this number is likely an undercount. Many who live through these disturbing visions stay silent, held back by shame or the fear of being dismissed as unstable. In interviews, some admit they worried about being labeled as crazy or felt their story would only bring judgment or ridicule. The accounts that do surface form only the visible part of a much larger phenomenon. Brian Melvin, according to his own account, found himself falling, not floating, but dropping fast, into a darkness so absolute it erased any sense of direction or time. The first thing he noticed was the absence of sound, then a pressure as if the air itself had thickened. He described a heat that grew with every second, a dry, suffocating weight pressing against his skin. In that void, shapes began to move. He said they were silhouettes, not quite human, watching him with a silent, hostile curiosity. The confusion gave way to fear as he realized he couldn't move, couldn't speak, and the darkness felt alive, closing in around him. The fear sharpened into something worse, a sense of being judged, measured, and found wanting. According to Melvin, the realization came slowly, like waking up inside a nightmare that had no end. Each story is examined not just for what happened, but for the patterns that repeat, motifs that surface again and again, even when the details and backgrounds differ. What emerges is a map, partial, incomplete, but more revealing than any single testimony alone. Howard Storm's story, detailed in his memoir and repeated in interviews, follows a different path, but lands in a place just as bleak. Storm, a university professor, was hospitalized after a sudden medical emergency. He later described the moment his consciousness slipped away from the hospital room. Instead of peace, he found himself in a gray, featureless landscape. Figures appeared, first at a distance and then closer, calling him to follow. Their voices seemed friendly at first, but as he moved with them, the tone changed. Storm reported that the group became mocking, then violent. He wrote that he was attacked, torn at by hands and voices, stripped not just of dignity, but of hope. There was no light, no comfort, only the sense of being trapped and tormented. In his account, the pain was not just physical but existential, a total loss of control with no promise of rescue. For Storm, the experience did not end until he called out for help, but the memory of that darkness never left him. The fear, he said, was not of death, but of being abandoned in a place where mercy did not exist. Across these accounts, the pattern grows clearer, and the descent is both literal and symbolic. A sudden break from ordinary reality is followed by sensory shock, then a progression into environments marked by threat and confinement. The details differ: heat, violence, crowding, but the emotional trajectory is the same. Confusion gives way to fear, and fear to a realization that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. The descent is not just physical, but emotional and existential. And for those who report these journeys, the memory lingers long after the body has returned. Priscilla McGill, according to her account, woke to a world of heat. She described the sensation as total, not a distant fire, but a furnace pressing in from every direction. Her words carried the weight of someone searching for language strong enough to capture pain. It was not just hot, it was suffocating, a dry, relentless burn that wrapped her body and mind. She remembered trying to scream, but the air itself seemed to scorch her throat, leaving only silence and the taste of ash. The fear was not of dying, but of being left in that place, with no promise of relief or end. Later, McGill admitted that she kept her story to herself for years, haunted by the memory and by the worry that no one would believe her. The shame was almost as heavy as the pain, a secret she carried alone. Hell, as most people imagine it, wasn't always that way. The blazing pit, the endless screams, the idea of punishment after death, these are the results of centuries of shifting belief, art, and anxiety. In the earliest Greek and Hebrew texts, the afterlife was a shadowy, neutral place. Hades in Greek tradition was a dim underworld where all souls gathered, stripped of memory and ambition, wandering in a kind of twilight. Sheol, described in the Hebrew Bible, was a silent pit beneath the earth, neither a reward nor a punishment, just the final destination for everyone, righteous or wicked alike. There was no fire, no judgment, no division, only the press of the crowd, the sense of fading into a vast, anonymous company of the dead. Over time, these neutral realms began to shift. During the Second Temple period, Jewish texts such as 1st Enoch and 2nd Esdras introduced the idea of punishment after death. The wicked would be bound, scorched by fire, and made to suffer torments that mirrored apocalyptic visions. The motif of burning, of being trapped in an abyss, became a way to express divine anger and cosmic justice. Early Christian texts took up these images, layering them onto the older Greek and Hebrew foundations. The Gospels speak of Gehenna, a real valley outside Jerusalem, once a site for burning refuse, now transformed into a symbol of unending flame and regret. Church fathers like Augustine and Origen expanded on these visions, describing a landscape where sinners were tormented by fire, their cries echoing in a place mapped by sermons and scripture. The Middle Ages brought another transformation. Dante Alighieri, writing in the early 14th century, gave hell its most enduring shape. In the Divine Comedy, hell is no longer a vague pit, but a vast, ordered system, 9 circles, each reserved for a different sin, each with its own punishments. Dante's hell is crowded and physical, souls wailing in rivers of flame, bodies twisted and confined, demons standing guard. His vision drew on centuries of art and preaching, but it set a new standard, one that would echo through paintings, stained glass, and drama for generations. The frescoes of Giotto, the triptychs of Bosch, these images filled cathedrals and homes, turning literary torments into something seen and felt. Other cultures spun their own versions. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, the Narakas are realms of heat and pain, where souls are judged and punished before moving on. Norse mythology imagined Hel as a cold, misty domain for those who died without glory, a place of silence, not fire, but still marked by the crowd and the descent. Across continents, the core motifs repeat: a journey downward, a crowd of the lost, a sensation of heat or cold, the threat of confinement, and the presence of pain or lamentation. Historians and religious scholars remind us that these images are not fixed laws, but evolving symbols. Each era recasts the afterlife to fit its own fears and hopes, borrowing from neighbors and reimagining old stories. As one Dante scholar says, "We inherit the maps our ancestors drew, even if we no longer believe in the places they marked." Steve Kang's reported experience adds another layer, a sense of overwhelming crowd and suffocation. According to his testimony, the descent was sudden, like being pulled by an invisible force. He described landing in a space packed with faceless figures pressed shoulder to shoulder, all moving in slow, chaotic patterns. The noise was constant, a low, anxious murmuring that never resolved into words. Kang said he tried to move, but found himself hemmed in on all sides. Every attempt to speak or push through was swallowed by the press of bodies. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of panic that seemed to seep into his thoughts. He reported that the feeling was not just of being trapped, but of being forgotten, one among thousands, all desperate to escape, but unable to find a way out. The claustrophobia was total, a crowd without a face, a place where the self was erased by the sheer mass of others.
One widely circulated account, known only as Barb,
describes a different kind of torment.
Barb's story first appeared in online forums,
stripped of identifying details, told under the protection of anonymity.
According to her account, she found herself in a cell, small, filthy, the walls slick with something she could not name.
The air was thick, heavy with the stench of decay.
She tried to stand, but the floor was slick and cold, and every movement sent jolts of pain through her limbs. Barb described the sense of being watched.
Not by people, but by presences that pressed in from the darkness, their attention sharp and unfriendly. Escape was impossible. The cell had no door, no window, and time stretched out until it lost all meaning. Barb wrote that the worst part was not the pain,
but the certainty that she had been forgotten,
left to suffer in a place where no one would ever come looking. Stories like these rarely make it into the public record. The stigma is powerful. Survivors speak of the fear that their pain will be dismissed as madness, or worse, as a sign of personal failing. In interviews, some admit that shame kept them silent for years. The accounts that do surface are fragmented, often told in whispers or behind pseudonyms, shaped by the need for privacy and self-protection. Yet the motifs repeat: burning, confinement, a sense of hostile presence, and the dread that what has happened is not just a hallucination, but a glimpse of something lasting. These are not the visions of peace or reunion that fill bestsellers and talk shows. They are stories of being trapped, of pain that does not end, and of the silence that follows when the world moves on. The question lingers. How many more remain untold, hidden behind the walls of shame and disbelief? Science offers explanations, but none erase the unease at the heart of these accounts. Oxygen deprivation, anoxia, stands as the first mechanism. During cardiac arrest, as blood flow drops, the cortex is starved of air. Clinical studies on hypoxia show that this state can trigger hallucinations, tunnels, flashes, or a heavy sense of heat and darkness. The burning Priscilla McGill described matches lab reports. Rats placed in low oxygen chambers first thrash, then fall still as their brains erupt with electrical storms. Human survivors sometimes recall not peace, but pressure, heat, and the taste of ash, sensations mapped onto the brain's failing circuits. Temporal lobes, perched above the ears, shape memory, emotion, and the sense of presence. Temporal lobe epilepsy can spark complex hallucinations, voices, figures, the feeling of being watched. EEG recordings from seizure patients and trauma survivors show chaotic firing patterns, especially during distressing near-death experiences marked by continuous screaming or mocking voices. The motif of a hostile, faceless crowd echoes the brain's tendency under stress to multiply threats, real or imagined. REM intrusion forms another hypothesis. Sometimes the boundaries between waking and dreaming collapse. The mind, unmoored from the body, slips into a state where nightmares bleed into reality. Dissociative states, common in trauma and acute stress, can bring sensations of falling or being trapped as the brain's spatial networks lose their grip. The recurring descent motif, the pull into darkness, may be the mind's own structure faltering under pressure. Trauma clinicians observe that survivors of distressing near-death experiences often show symptoms mirroring PTSD, intrusive memories, nightmares, reluctance to speak. The brain, in its effort to survive, can encode terror so deeply that it becomes a permanent shadow. Some find transformation, others a wound that never heals. Yet these frameworks, anoxia, temporal lobe spikes, REM intrusion, trauma, never fully contain the stories. The motifs persist: descent, darkness, heat, hostile presences, and most hauntingly, screaming. Ronald Reagan, not the president, described after a stabbing and near-fatal blood loss a place where screams never stopped. He later said those voices changed him more than the violence ever could. Science sketches the outlines, but the web of motifs remains. Each hypothesis explains a piece, but none dispel the sense that, for some, what they saw was not illusion, but a place. If even a fraction of these accounts are true, the question lingers: is something already waiting? Hell, as most people imagine it, wasn't always that way. Today, distressing near-death experiences remain underreported, their patterns unsettlingly consistent across cultures and eras. If even a fraction of these accounts are real, then the question isn't just what happens after we die, it's whether something is already waiting. Sometimes, what haunts us most is not the unknown, but the possibility that someone, somewhere, has already seen it.